Good evening, and welcome to the Poe Museum. I appear to have found myself underneath the floorboards again, but while I try to extricate myself from this predicament, why don't you enjoy another edition of the Poe Museum's Curator's Crypt. Welcome to the Poe Museum's Curator's Crypt. If you visited the Poe Museum in Richmond lately, you've probably taken advantage of the opportunity to try out being buried alive in our own coffin. Kids of all ages enjoy stepping inside and having their pictures taken for social media. Now, Edgar Allan Poe wrote that to be buried while alive is beyond question the most terrific of extremes that has ever fallen upon the lot of mere mortality. In fact, he said the subject was too terrible for the purposes of legitimate fiction. So of course he wrote about it time and again in tales like The Castle of Amontillado, The Fall of the House of Usher, Berenice, and of course, The Premature Burial. And for that last tale, the Poe Museum owns a tiny manuscript in Poe's own handwriting, no bigger than a post-it. Now of course this isn't it, this is a post-it. This is it. In Poe's day, being buried alive was rare, but it could happen. Oftentimes, people didn't die in the hospital, they died at home, didn't have a doctor there to declare them dead. They had to depend upon their family to perform all the usual tests, put a mirror under the nose to see if you're breathing, test your pulse, maybe even prick you with a needle. If that didn't work, this was before embalming got really popular, so they wanted to hurry up and get you buried before you started to decay. This was especially bad in summertime, when the process of decomposition was accelerated, but also during plagues and pandemics, like cholera and yellow fever outbreaks. When people just wanted to get their dead loved ones buried quickly before the disease spread. They didn't exactly know how cholera was spreading, so might as well get the body buried quickly. That resulted in newspaper accounts of people being buried while still alive. It didn't have to happen that often, but it splashed across the headlines, buried alive, not dead but sleeping. Out of New Orleans, there came an account of people attending a funeral, and they heard from a nearby grave a moaning sound. They quickly dug up that fresh grave and realized, oops, we buried someone alive. Back here in Richmond, there was an account from Poe's time of a man who'd had a sudden seizure. The doctors did everything they could, which in those days probably would have involved bloodletting, maybe shocking him with a galvanic pile. Nothing worked, so they said, he's dead, let's bury him. Fortunately, his wife decided to open up his mouth and pour some whiskey down his throat, which revived him. Not the recommended treatment for somebody you think is dead, but it worked in that case. And in 1843, Christian Eiselbrand patented the life-preserving coffin up in Baltimore. This was a special coffin which not only allowed you to communicate with the outside world in case you woke up in the grave, but also if you moved, it'd pop the top off for you. Which works great if you're in a crypt, not so great if you're 6 feet underground. If that were the case, you had different options including breathing tubes. There were also coffins available with bells on them you could ring in case you need to wake somebody up. An account out of Germany at the time said that someone actually did wake up in their coffin, rang the bell, but the night watchman at the cemetery was so terrified by the sound, he had a heart attack and dropped dead. So Poe knew what was being written about, and he decided, that's what I need to exploit. I need to write about the things that really affect people and something they're powerless to control. In Poe's day, it was kind of difficult to tell who is alive and who is dead. So in Poe's own words, he said, "The boundaries which divide life from death are at best shadowy and vague. Who shall say where one ends and where the other begins?" And in Poe's tale, The Premature Burial, we begin with a series of supposedly factual accounts of people being buried alive in different parts of the world, how their bodies were discovered later. A woman who awoke in the crypt, went to the door of the crypt, but dropped dead. They found her body years later, decayed and attached to the door. So after these supposedly factual accounts, Poe's narrator tells us that he has an all-abiding terror of being buried alive, and that's how the story begins. But after the fellow overcomes his fear, Poe leaves us with this concluding paragraph, which is recorded on the Poe Museum's manuscript. "There are moments when even to the sober eye of reason the world of our sad humanity may assume the semblance of hell. But the imagination of man is no Carathis to explore with impunity its every cavern. Alas, the grim legion of sepulchral terrors cannot be regarded as altogether fanciful, but like the demons in whose company Afrasiab made his voyage down the Oxus, they must sleep, or they will devour us. They must be suffered to slumber, or we perish." Well, some of that made sense. Poe is saying that sometimes the world is such a horrific place that reality takes on the semblance of hell. And then he starts talking about Carathis, which is a witch from a novel that Poe would have read, and she was sent to hell, but she had one day before eternal damnation to explore hell, and she just had a great time there. But Poe here is saying that, no, we are not going to have that chance to just explore it with impunity and have a good time. We're going to suffer from innumerable terrors. Now the second reference about the slumbering demons is from another novel by Horace Binnie Wallace that Poe also would have read, because both these quotes are sort of similar to quotes from that same novel called Stanley from 1838. And in this one, a fellow is traveling down the river Oxus, and as the line implies, the demons are slumbering, but if he wakes them, they will devour him. So what we get from Poe is that the world is hell, or at least looks like hell. So why is this quotation, this last paragraph of the story, on a piece of paper the size of a Post-it? Well, Poe apparently liked this quote from his story so much he reprinted it without the rest of the story in his article Marginalia that appeared in the June 1849 issue of the Southern Literary Messenger. Now, the series of articles called Marginalia extended back to 1844, so it's been going on for 5 years already, and Poe would just have brief paragraphs covering different topics ranging from the electric light bulb to different poets whose works he liked or didn't like, to the subject of genius, to the fate of humanity. And for this one of his very last installments, he wrote to the editor of the Southern Literary Messenger, John Reuben Thompson, and told him that these would be very personal ones. They would differ in character from previous installments of Marginalia, because in those sometimes he took on a more general tone, talked about popular issues of the day. This time he was talking about his own philosophy on life. So here we have Poe, the last year of his life, writing about how after all the suffering and hardship he's experienced, life, reality, they've all taken on the semblance of hell. So this week's episode is a bit of a downer. But back to the reason why the manuscript is so tiny. It's because towards the end of his life, Poe started cutting his paper into thin strips. And then he would glue the strips end to end to make long strips of paper he'd roll up like scrolls. If he were giving a public reading of The Raven, for instance, they said he would stand on stage and unravel the scroll for The Raven. And some of his late poems, like Annabel Lee and The Bells, exist in scroll form. He also would send the scrolls to publishers, so some of his late stories are in scroll form. So these marginalia articles were written on long strips of paper. And he wrote to Thompson saying, as you're editing them, if there's anything you don't like, just cut it out of the scroll and glue the other pieces back together. So Poe invented cutting and pasting. So that explains why this little piece of paper exists as it does. The Poe Museum also owns another portion of that same installment of Marginalia in which Poe wrote about the difficulties of being better than everyone else and how difficult it is to have to suffer from being misunderstood and misinterpreted by people who just can't appreciate your genius. So remember that, everybody. If people hate you, you just might be better than they are. So when the Poe Museum reopens, I hope you'll have a chance to come here and see the manuscript for the premature burial yourself. And also, while you're at it, why don't you try out our coffin for size? Well, thanks for joining us for this week's installment of the Poe Museum's Curator's Crypt. If you'd like to avoid being buried alive, why don't you try reading one of Poe's many classic terror tales in one of these fine books in the Poe Museum's online store, which you can access today at poemuseum.org/museum-store.